Hello, everybody. Grant Hunter here for another Product Conversations. May, we were talking, gosh, a month or so ago about potential topics to talk about on here. And you said that you're seeing a lot of people asking about budgeting, whether they're first time product leaders worrying about budgeting, whether it's that time of year and we're having to do our annual budgeting. And I happen to have been doing it with a client recently. Uh, this is a topic we haven't really hit it on the head in the 3+ years we've been doing this. We've talked about annual planning, but that often takes it in a different way: annual versus strategic planning versus the budgeting aspects. And so, talk to me about why you thought budgeting was something, or budgets was something we should be getting some insight on. You're on mute.
It's not even just it's not even just the idea of like how do you budget, but what is a budget, right? Like think about all the like going through your entire career as a product manager, you could basically never touch a budget until you own a budget, right? So I feel like that learning curve is huge. And for most people, when you do get that role, you probably hire a coach or, get a whole bunch of people to help you out along the way. But I think people need to know how we determine how much money we're going to spend on an organization. And it's not even just people, right? It's people, it's tooling, it's all this other stuff that people don't think about. And so
I definitely
I'm
want to dig into that.
yeah,
That all that
I'm
other stuff.
curious. And so yeah, I'm approaching this from like a place of genuine like I don't even know how this works. So it
So,
was more
from
from
May's curiosity into budgets and budgeting and how do we manage them and how they go them, we've put together a panel of some amazing product leaders. Returning to product conversations, Marlon Davis and Pradeep Bolchandani. We got Sweelin Yap and Derek Bluestone, both coming on for the first time. So we're going to have a great conversation on budgets, budgeting. I've actually got a question in here about, are we underinvesting? Because I think that goes with budgeting. But the first question I wanted to ask, and I'm going to get this to everybody, is what factors do you consider when putting together a budget for your project organization? And for that, I'd love to start with Derek.
Well, thanks, Grant. It's good to be here with you all. The first thing when you get into position, as May was saying, a lot of times product managers are really kind of engaged at the end of the cycle, right? What usually happens is a spreadsheet gets sent around that says, does this look right? And so, are we still using this software, right? Are we still doing this, and so the first thing is really understanding the context of a budget and how it gets put together. And it really does depend on the stage of the company's growth and the market conditions, et cetera. But I think there are a couple of high level things that I would suggest here. One is understand that budgeting is a team sport, that the relationship with the CFO and others are crucial in understanding. If you walk a mile in the CFO's shoes, and understand what they're trying to accomplish, and if you understand the top level goals of the company, are we trying to be a rule of 40 company? Are we trying to grow like gangbusters and we're not worried about profitability? And we've been asked to do X, Y, and Z. All this context is important to consider. And I think the other thing that I would say, and these are just kind of framework things, is there are basically two ways to do a budget. When you really get into it, there's top down and bottom up. And the top down methodology is the most common. If you really think about it, it's like, well, here's how much we spent last year. And so we need an update. We need an update from you as the chief product officer, VP product, director of product, whatever your role happens to be. What needs to change about this based on the initiatives we're trying to achieve and the financial profile that we have. And then there's a bottoms up, which 9 times out of 10 is largely a waste of time, because it's usually an exercise in Vision Quest. It's like, okay, tell me what you need, and you usually end up with like 5x, right, of what
the budget, what the finance people on top down give you.
Exactly. So there, and the last thing I'll say on this is there are some important business indicators and metrics to consider when you're thinking about how to approach the budget itself. So last 12 months, you'll see this abbreviation LTM in a lot of financial spreadsheets. Last 12 months. What's your gross revenue retention rate? What's your net revenue retention rate? What's your bookings over the last 12 months? Average contract value? What is your MRR, ARR run rate? And what's that's last 12 months. And then what's the forecast for the next 12 months? So, I just stopped there. It's a lot to think about, but that's really like when and as I've been doing this for a long time, and I always wanted to be in the room. Like I always wanted the seat at the table, right? As a product manager, I want to work my way up to the chief product officer role. I was like, oh, that's how it works, right? It's not, oh, okay. You got to really understand some of this other stuff to get good at this. So I'll stop there and pass it back to you, Grant.
Thank you, Derek. And it's interesting because I had mentioned in my post about this, we had been talking with Cliff Giley from Gartner on annual planning, and he's like, he felt like the budgeting process was messed up, and it's like we should be the way we allocate budgeting for work. And I think the reality is the top down is how it does, and it's not really taking into effect strategic options we have and where we could be investing. It's more of a flat rate. Here's what you got. It's last year's cost plus 5% just for raises or whatever. And not very strategic the way we do that. Sweet Lynn, I'd love to get your take, add on, agree with what Derek said, bring some other ideas of what you've seen happen. And generally, how do we, what factors do we need to consider?
Sounds great. Happy to be here. So building upon what Derek mentioned about the top down and bottoms up, one process I find really helpful is this W framework, where you start off with the company level goals, like financial goals, because that enables what Derek was mentioning, bottoms up wise, creating some constraints about what we are investing in and what we are not investing in, because that sets very clear expectations across the organization. So that's the first thing. Is process wise, this top down, coming down with the vision and strategy, but also bottoms up. The working teams who are closer to the work, they're able to feed in their input as well. And then middle management will typically roll this up in terms of how we're investing. And then we also deduping across the various teams. And then the team actually translate that into an execution plan. So that's the first part of more on the process side. One part I would add is one thing I find really helpful in budgeting is thinking zero-based. So rather than thinking, from last year, what is the percentage change? Say assuming we're a new company, how will we invest our budget this coming cycle? So that's the first one, is on the process. The second one actually is that as part of the process, actually, when I think about budgets, it's about resource allocation. And it's very similar to building a product. What is the product you want to build, a business you want to build, but also what's the team and culture and capabilities you want to build? Because then you can work backwards in terms of the components of the budget. How are we investing in our people, whether it's full-time employees, contractors? How are we thinking about their skills? So how are we investing in internal or external learning and development, and conference opportunities? How are we thinking about tech stack ranging from like data to like tools for like user research, etc.? And obviously there's a fun component. What's the culture we're building, especially with a distributed team? How do we think about travel spend, social spend, etc.? And so I think like working backwards from like what is our vision, strategy, roadmap, and like the culture on the build is really critical, because aligning on that is helpful, because when it comes down to like calculating the dollars and cents and making trade-offs, having that alignment up front helps navigate those conversations.
It's interesting. I feel like every conversation we do, no matter what the topic, gets back to strategy, right? And I love the concept of the W, right? Because if you start with the strategy and the vision and those boundary conditions about what are we trying to succeed, that really should drive a lot of what we're doing budgeting wise. But I also love how it also ties into the organization and the roles, because even if even if in the reality, a lot of companies, I mean, when I've dealt this, it wasn't like I said, as Derek said, I'll build a bottoms up and it's going to be 3-5x what the CFO is thinking and earmarking, right? But it also challenges us to think about what's the best use of the resources. If this is all we have, if we only have 10 heads or whatever it may be, how do we best, allocate those resources? Maybe we need to shift some resources that are product management into design because we don't have design, or product marketing because we're not doing well there. And it really, I think from your comment, Sweelan, it was about how do you break outside of the constructs, right? Just because this is how we've done it, that part of this conversation in the budgeting should be, do we have the right seats on the bus? Do we have the right people in the seats? And even if there's no different budget, helping us think through that. So wonderful. Thank you, Sweelan. Marlon, factors. Obviously, Puneet, it's going to be hard because Derek, Sweelan, and Marlon are going to come first. So I'm putting the tough one on you to come after Marlon. So Marlon, building on Derek and Sweelan.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. You hit the hammer. You hit the nail with the hammer. I'm trying to get that analogy right with the strategy here. So right out the gate, I'm stumbling. So let me recover. It all starts with strategy. And I had a CEO who came, it's about 6 years ago, came to a company I was working at, and he brought a process to us. And I can't recall the book. It was one of Jeffrey Moore's books where you kind of look at your product portfolio and you decide and determine which products are material and which are immaterial. And then you try and bucket those things from a strategy perspective to say, what are we going to do for the year? Who's going to do it? And what tools are we going to give them, to accomplish that work? And so the framework that he put in place to work on that was I think it's McKinsey is the original, the 3 Horizons strategy framework.
3 Horizons. Yep.
Yeah, which really was like, oh my God, all this time I've been budgeting for like these 12 months, almost like Derek was saying, like, give me the old budget and I'll put plus, 10% on it and plus 25% on it. And once he kind of, brought that strategy framework to the company, I was like, oh my God, I've actually should have been budgeting for activities in 3 different areas. One for this year, one for whatever emergent opportunities that we were going to be needing to research or work on, and then one, which is a very small percentage of what you're going to do from a product perspective, is what's going to happen 5 years out that we need to maybe do some market research for, right? So not all activities are going to be product development that you need to, fund and hiring your talent or organize your talent around it. So that's kind of how I start off with the budgets, is to say, like, what do we need to do, for Horizon 1, 2, and 3 for this year? What do we need to do? And who's going to do it? So, what's the work that needs to get done? Let's apply who needs to do it. And then what tools do we need? So it kind of breaks down into product strategy type work, roadmaps, markets, portfolios, partnerships. Number 2 is product development that gets into, are we going to do discovery? Probably not going to do customer discovery for this H1, but we're going to need to do it for H2. So we'll do product discovery though, because we're only looking at features that need to get developed and released in this year. So I'm going to need product managers to do that work, the sprints, the commercialization. Then you get down into product operations. Okay, do we have any data? Where are we getting our product usage data from? Who's doing the win-loss, activities? Where are we pulling all that data from? So you start to look at all of that and you go, okay, here's who I got, and here are the systems we have, here are the gaps, and let's have that conversation, CFO and CEO. And if we're spread too thin, let's have a conversation. What would you like me not to do? Unless you're going to give me a few more resources, because this is a prioritization effort exercise as much as it is a budgeting exercise for you guys to say what's most important to the business. Because here's what I got.
So many things came to mind. It made me think about, Steve Johnson, my partner, often is quoted as saying, right, sales is about hitting this year's number, product management about hitting next year's number. So obviously we have to make sure we have stuff in there. But your last point there, I've had so many conversations with CEOs, presidents about capacity, right?
Yeah.
We have a capacity with this budget of what we can deliver. And I had a CEO at a client once say, there is my head of sales is committing to what number he's going to deliver for fourth quarter next year. Why can't you commit to what you're going to deliver? I'm like, I can commit to deliver this many epics, right? We can deliver this much stuff, right? I don't think right now in 2024 you want me telling you what I'm going to be delivering in Q4 of 2025, because things may change, right? And so you have to have that capacity conversation about if you want this much, you have to give me the resources to do this much. And we can do it. So I love that. And I think the book from Jeffrey Moore was Zone to Win.
Exactly, that's it.
So great book. He breaks it into 4 zones. 2 of the zones are more Horizon 2 and 3, sort of a transformation zone and innovation zone. And then the other side of the zones were more operational and that type of stuff. Great place there. Puneet, factors. What have we missed?
I gotta add to this. These are great answers already, right? You put a bunch of product leaders in a room, we're gonna talk strategy. It's gonna come back to that, right? I think I'm gonna call out a couple of points that really resonated with me, and then I'm gonna take this in a slightly different direction where I think we're running. I think Grant, you're just touching upon this as well. So first off, I think Derek, you said it well, right? Like business context is key. It tells you how to invest. It tells you the trade-offs you're going to be making as a company. And I think it fundamentally starts there, right? I think to Sweeland's point, it adds the right constraints into our conversation. Different organizations are going to go with varying approaches based on how rigorous they want to be. And like going back to what May said, right? Like the first time I felt I was in this situation, in this position to actually start contributing to a budget and actually building a budget. The shocking thing to me was it's not as rigorous as you expect it to be. A lot of the times it is like looking at last year and using some very rough approximations, right? So I think
last year's monthly budget for what tools times 5% because we think there's going to be a price increase.
Exactly. Some inflation, some new tools, and there you go, right? And I think the 2 points I want to sort of build on here. I think one is context goes both ways. And we as product leaders are sort of in those shoes, right? To kind of look at the budget constraints we're putting in, the capacity limits that we have. And it's about then mapping that back to what can we actually do, right? What are the options we have on the table? And so scenario planning is one of my most go-to tools when it comes to talking about budget, right? You always have a base case in terms of what we expect to hit no matter what, right? With some growth goals in there, but like these are the things we can absolutely miss, right? That's the case we're managing towards. Then you always have your upsides that are based on like those strategic bets that you're making, the moonshots that you have, and you can tie certain budgetary items to that, right? Like your hiring, for example, you can unlock or stage gate hires based on how things are going along the year. You can also have downside scenarios, right? If things don't play out the way they're supposed to, like Grant, to your point about the quote that Steve always makes, right? If sales actually starts falling behind on their targets this year, you need to adjust your strategy, you need to adjust your tactics, and you better have that flexibility built into your budget as well, right? In terms of what you can cut, what you can change. So I think those scenarios are key to really think about. And that's the connection back into product strategy. The inherent challenge that we keep running up against, and I think this is where some of the frustrations might exist in the space, is product practices pull us towards wanting more agility, right? Being more reactive to what's happening in the market, and incorporating that into how we approach things, right? How we make decisions. But the budget and the annual planning cycle needs us to be more predictable, right? So you have those opposing forces that are always going to be pulling us in different directions, and we kind of have that job of finding the right balance there, which is difficult, right? Like there's an art to it. And so that's the thing I wanted to kind of open up to the group, right? How do you all navigate those challenges between the need to be more agile and flexible in your strategy and your plan versus the need to have predictability in your budget? Because if you want a truly agile plan and you can't really commit to which strategic bets you're going to make, then you have no other way to do your budget besides like look at last year and multiply it by 5% or 10%, right? But if you can be a little bit more upfront about like these are the strategic bets we're going to make and these are the things we're going to try to deliver upon, you can be a little bit more detailed and purposeful with your budget, but then you're kind of stuck to those initiatives, right? If they don't pan out, or if things suddenly change, now you're kind of stuck to that budget. So how do y'all reconcile this? Because that's something that I still am navigating and learning.
That's a great question. I mean, and I'm used to the sort of stage gate type stuff, saying if we hit these numbers or do this type of stuff, this position could come available. But I think, back in our annual planning conversation I mentioned earlier with what Cliff Giley was on, that was the big thing. It's like, how do we move from flat funding for the year to more funding opportunities, funding experiments to try to, and I think Derek mentioned it depends on where you are in your growth curve, right? If you're at a mature, I've spent a lot of my time at more mature enterprise companies, and at more mature enterprise companies, it's all about retention rates and expansion within existing clients. And it's a lot easier to have a flat budget because your revenue growth is maybe, mid single digits. You're happy if you can get to double digits. And so it's easier to be more predictive, especially for somebody in a growth phase or in a transition phase. Scott Southworth in the comments talked about a fourth horizon, which is sort of decommissioning or end of life. We had that on the call, but it starts changing some of these things. And I'd love to get, there's also a question in there. Samir said wants us to touch on CapEx versus OpEx. So what I'd love to do is, sort of on the fly, change a little. Let's go with that question. How do you deal with those scenarios? I'll put it to the group. Actually, May, do you have anything you want to add before we pivot from the first factor one?
No, but when you talked about like keeping clients and also selling within existing clients, one of my favorite terms I've learned is negative churn. Where instead of customers churning away, you just sell them more and make more money within the same core group of clients.
Yeah.
I want to touch a bit on the idea of like really that decommissioning piece, right? Because a lot of the time people think that if you decommission a product, you get a lot of money back. As you get like people are suddenly available, but no, decommissioning is a lot of work and there's actually a cost involved, especially if customers are unhappy about you just decommissioning the product, or they're going to have to re-implement or re-onboard with whatever migration path you have. So I think like that's something that people often don't plan for in their budgeting cycles. So I think it's worthwhile calling it out.
Yeah. So let me jump in there, because I think first of all, there's just fantastic conversation. I think so many great points made so far. As I was listening,
we'll try to keep it up, Derek.
Yeah. As I was listening to everyone and taking a few notes, I think it's important that we distinguish between budgeting and allocation. So and what I mean by that is you get at the end of the day, if you're really reductive about this, you get a pot of money, right? And what you do with that money is the allocation. So we might start the year and say, well, our plan is based on the following variables to the scenario planning. However, we have, based on the situation, we have certain level of flexibility. We want to fund one position, Okay, no, we actually want to reallocate those monies to something else, and do something different with it. So while on the face of it, sometimes that, okay, we're adding 5% or 7% or 10% to last year's run rate seems counterintuitive. If we take a creative approach and we say, well, it's really about the scenario planning and it's really about the allocations that we make going forward, it becomes really important. Now, I actually did have a couple notes to start on OpEx, CapEx, and cost of goods sold. There in today's world, there's not as much CapEx dialogue as there used to be. Not to say that it really depends on the company and everything, but it's mostly about OpEx, i.e., people and software and G&A, and then cost of goods sold, anything that is going into the product itself, or product portfolio itself. And it's really important to understand those things because it speaks to gross margin. It speaks to how you treat it. We could go nuts on the financial treatments too, whether we're doing accruals or other things like that. So I think that just last point on this is, again, it's a team sport. So when we think about it as product leaders, what's the biggest adjacency to our thought process in the budgeting? Engineering, and marketing, right? So like if we're not really tied closely together with how the engineering team and leadership is thinking about budgeting and the marketing team is thinking about budgeting, we're going to miss, right? And we're going to show up with a bunch of spreadsheets and look really out of sync. So it's really, really important, and that speaks to the capacity thing. It speaks to what we can get done, et cetera.
Jason Knight, a couple months ago when we were talking about sales and product together, talked about if you don't understand your go-to-market strategy, you can't have a product strategy. And I think that aligns exactly with what you said. I will say when it comes to CapEx versus OpEx, I've not ever had my team, my product managers, be considered CapEx, but I have had the development work done on the products. The engineers have been the CapEx. May?
That surprises me because at several large companies, everyone on the tech side of the organization has traditionally been CapEx, even designers and all that other stuff. OpEx was always services, implementation, sales.
And here's where, and there was a conversation earlier, and maybe I should have dug into more of the meetings with the accountants and finance people, but I was always more of a commercial P&L type product leader, so it was more of a business leader versus a delivery of it. But
yeah, I mean, but this is really about CapEx, OpEx, doesn't matter. It's really about the financial treatment, right? That we're talking about here, which is, are we accruing this expense? Meaning, are we spreading and prorating this expense over a period of time, or are we taking it in the period it is spent? And more, what I'm seeing is a move away from capitalizing and accruing. And again, it depends. Public companies sometimes are very keen on capitalizing an accrual because it reflects differently in their public statements and filings, where private companies tend to hew towards the taking the expense at the point of expenditure.
Yeah. One other thing, Marlon, I want to get to you. I'll get to you first, then I'll come back to one other thing on cap versus op.
Really quick, I was just going to add to that. Over in private equity too, we did look at CapEx because we were trying to spread it out, and because you have covenants many times in place that you're trying to adhere to. So that's another reason why you may take into account whether this should be CapEx versus OpEx. Just in another scenario. Just wanted to add that to Derek's.
Thank you, Marlon. One interesting thing, I was having a conversation with a former chief strategy officer of a really, really, really big company, and it was about, the underinvestment in product, organic product, how big companies would rather acquire CapEx, uh, established companies, and they would, and this hesitance to like invest in product because they want to, they'll buy it if it's proven, but the risk tolerance of building themselves was not there. So one other way to look at CapEx versus OpEx in product is that sort of build, buy, acquire type approach when we're looking at it. So that just sort of to wrap up the CapEx, OpEx. Companies, especially A, private equity owned, and B, really big public companies, tend to be willing to spend $400 million to buy some startup who has maybe gotten product market fit, where they don't want to put an additional $4 million into product development organically, just because it hits the balance sheet differently. So I want to ask, and maybe this is my own biases I'm pushing in on here. Are our product organization budgets chronically underinvesting in the practice of product management? I look at, and again, I look at how much money is spent on sales training and sales kickoffs and sales events. I look at how much money is spent on agile coaching and all the certifications and that type of stuff. And I look at how much money people don't spend on product management to try to improve the practice in the organizations. Is that a place that we're underinvesting as a whole?
I mean, I can try to take.
I know if one person agrees with me.
It just feels like a trap.
It's not a trap. I've written an article on it, so I truly believe that we're way under investing.
There's absolutely much more we could be doing on this front, right? But what I've seen mostly, and it might be partial to this based on my experiences, right? I've almost always been able to justify a budgetary investment in this area. My struggle has always been with time. So like making the actual time to focus on the craft of product management and schedule those types of trainings and those workshops, especially something that's intensive and it's going to be a long running thing. Carving out the time for it has been the challenge more than the money for it.
Okay.
I think it's partially because of the fact that, at least with the product management team, folks are so in the weeds in terms of the day-to-day of running of the company, the micro decisions that are always coming up, right? Even getting them time to actually regroup as a team to be able to share knowledge with each other and share challenges that they're facing. That in itself takes a fair amount of diligence to really carve out that time and defend it from everything else, because the nature of the work is you're reacting to fires, right? You are like, firefighting is a big part of the job. And so that's at least been my challenge with this. I'm definitely curious to hear other perspectives on this.
Yeah, I do agree. There's, I've shared this joke with Grant before, I think, but my joke is everybody wants to be a product manager until they have to be one, and so and you could apply that to any discipline, by the way, right? Everybody thinks they're a sales expert until they have to sell something, so it's not exclusive to us in our trade. But to the question about under investment, I really think it depends on the context and the imperatives of the business. In highly acquisitive type of model, sometimes the financial engineering that goes on in these leaves you short in terms of staffing. And in other situations in growth stage companies, I've seen overinvestment before revenue shows up, and that puts different kind of pressure on the business. I think this is actually more, and we won't. I don't know that we want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but if we think about the state of product management today and the kind of what a day in a life is, this is a lot. I think I agree with Vineet on this. Is like it is about creating an environment where people can be successful at this craft and not burning people out and creating a sustainable model. You know, everyone forgets that bit in the Agile Manifesto about things being sustainable. They just think it means going faster, but it's actually about creating a sustainable value creation model. So I don't know whether it's a question of underinvestment. I think certainly there's some companies that will just hew to a set of formulas, right? And say, well, this is the number of product managers we should have based on X, Y, and Z versus what do we actually need to be successful. So, you know, it's tough again as you climb the ladder and you start getting into the room where these decisions are made. The more information you have about the performance of the team and the performance of the company, the better you can make the argument, and you can. I think somebody mentioned, you know, position the trade-offs correctly.
Awesome, Derek. Sui Lin, I'd love to get your take on this.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. So how I think about investing in the product craft is that both at the collective and as well as the individual level. And so what that means is I do this as part of performance reviews and quarterly planning to not just have a product roadmap, go-to-market or insights roadmap, but also what the talent roadmap look like, and what kind of capabilities does the business need? Because to Derek and Puneet's point, like time is limited, and so really focusing just in time, what kind of like training or up leveling and making it relevant to the team that they can immediately apply rather than just conceptual. So it varies a lot by what the business needs. Because then the team also knows, oh, I need to invest in this now because I need to deliver on X, Y, Z, and I can apply this. So it could range from, like in the past, it could be when I was going through M&A, it was like across training, just organizational context. That was what was really critical. Versus like in another scenario, it was like driving product-led growth. So making sure everyone had a growth mindset of like what growth means. And in today's world, it's like elevating the team in terms of the era of AI. What are the critical capabilities and what's relevant to the organizational context that we operate in? And obviously that's at the team level. And what I found really helpful to Puneet's question about how do you carve out time is every quarter I tell my team, this is the area of focus that we're going to focus on. And then at the individual level, as we talk about OKRs, I coach my managers to coach the team. This is your area of focus in terms of growth that I would like to see. Because there's so many things we can all improve on, but like picking one area and going deep, I find really helpful and actionable for the team.
Awesome. Thank you, Sui Lin. Marlon, anything to add?
For once, I think I'm going to be silent and say ditto on with everything that Sui Lin said. I agree with it.
I think, and I'm chiming in earlier. I know we're going to do our takeaways at the end, but I think Puneet right now is the leader in the clubhouse with finding the time, right? That's as much of an issue. In working with clients, I see the product managers already, most organizations are so stuck in the weeds already, let alone making the time to do the market discovery type stuff they should be doing to help with planning for the future. It's hard to find the time to do that type of stuff. But and tied sort of maybe in the clubhouse of Sui Lin's idea of making that quarterly plan, right? Even maybe it's each quarter, here's the skill or capability we're going to focus on, maybe provide some high level type stuff, but also give them the chance to work on it and that type of stuff. I love how that can go. And it came in here as a budget thing because I think there is an underinvestment, but it's also an operations thing. So May, part to me, this is an product ops thing.
Yeah. So a whole bunch of things that people do, like learning can be free-ish, right? Like, yes, you do need to bring in people sometimes, but The cost, like when people think about courses, right? It's always just, you sign up your whole team for Reforge, it costs you a whole lot of money, and then half of them don't even take it, or they sign up for the course and they're like, oh yeah, it's fine, or they just don't have the time to absorb the giant waterfall of information you get over the 4 weeks or whatever it is. So I think it's really important to like kind of think about how people learn. I'm a former educator, so I spend a lot of time thinking about like how do humans actually learn. So a lot of it, what I and my peers have found successful is kind of just building learning into almost everything that you do, right? Like a bit of give people opportunities to share what they learned via their metrics to really like promote that notion of like, hey, this is something new I found that we could do with the data, and like this is how I did it. And then someone else like if you had that platform, like people could have conversations about how do we do this better, or like how is this relevant. But it's really going back to that whole culture piece, like how do you like putting that time aside to have these conversations, budgeting for that time as a part of the work, and really in a way redefining what the work of our teams are, right? I think that's a part of it. It's not really budget, but it's like
Well,
there are things that are free-ish, right?
well, but or is it right? We you can't set budget is the funding that we, as Derek said, allocate to different things. And if culture and capability development, all those things help make us more efficient, which actually expand our capacity to deliver or our success rate or whatever it may be, you have to factor some of these things into your budgeting and allocation decisions because you're trying to you're trying to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts.
I want to challenge that because isn't this a part of our jobs anyways? People feel like they don't have the time to learn because they don't see learning as a part of the job.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to Peter Senge and the fifth discipline and figure out how do we make learning organizations happen and use dialogue and everything we do. But I get that, but I think that there's still a place in the budget for whether it's allocating it properly with the right personnel, whether it's doing some sort of capability development, whether it's in a day or two training or spread out over the year. Derek?
Yeah. So I was just going to say, like, this is a tough. I think we've just landed on something that's really tough, both in practice of our craft as well as budgeting, and the one of the things that, and again, this comes back to I think something that Puneet referenced around kind of guarding people's time and creating the space for this is oftentimes, I'd say over the last 5 to 7 years, the best kind of investments in training and professional development is actually to get people out of the office, right? Go to a conference, go to, we just sent, my company, we just sent a couple of people to the Pendo conference, they come back with new perspective, new energy, and maybe something very pragmatic that they can apply. And I think there's a bit of weariness with, okay, there's e-learning, there's a LinkedIn learning course you should take. That's all great. Like I'm not talking any of that down. I think it has a place, and but if we think about where people live in their day-to-day jobs and the burnout factor with product managers these days, honestly, the best thing I think we could do is get people out of the office, get them out of the intense kind of, out of the scrum, out of the the pressurized environment that they're in, and give them that space. There are other things you can do, but as I think about budgets for this, I think about blocks per staff member, right, on the team. Is okay, we're going to allocate X $1,000s a year per person, and then we're going to do an individualized professional development plan, and we're going to encourage and create the space and in the T&E budget for them to get out of the office, jump on an airplane, go somewhere, and learn something, and build their network, and bring it back.
No, I love that. And I think part of what we try to do with these product conversations is, even if it's just for an hour on every other Friday, give a place where people can go and have the conversations, and get outside of that box, and maybe pick up some new perspectives. I know I have for 160 whatever of these episodes we've done. So, uh, new perspectives is so critical. May, you said you had a question you want to ask.
Okay, this is a spicy one. Um, so I was working in this like growth stage organization, and we're growing at about 10% a year. And one of our product leaders took a step back and looked at, all the opportunities there were, and said, it's completely realistic that we triple our account base in, say 5 years, right? Like we're growing at 10% a year. Suddenly we're like, we could triple. Like this is extremely realistic. And all of a sudden, when you start talking to the other leaders about it, everyone said, how are we supposed to do that? Right? Like right now we're building at, our infrastructure is catered towards 10% growth. Our support staff has absolutely no way they can handle triple the accounts. Our sales staff can't handle it, and so on and so forth, right? So how do you go about having that larger budgeting organization when you see that vision, like that opportunity for like real growth? Because you have to convince the CFO to like completely change the plan, right?
That's a
Did
great
they
question.
did they do any strategic planning in that organization, May? Because that's where that conversation should be happening.
Yes. So say it's like one of your reports comes to you and says, this is possible, and they built this business plan, and they said this is possible. What would you do with
Yeah,
it?
it's got to go back to the senior leadership for strategic planning. And I don't mean like your annual, we're going to pull out everything we did last year and do the strategic plan. I mean real strategic planning. Let's go back, let's look. If we didn't do it before, what are we looking at for the next 3 to 5 years? Because we should have had some expectations around growth amongst all of us as senior leaders. So if somebody is bringing something up to us that presents a better opportunity for better growth, that conversation needs to make its way back into the senior leaders, executive leaders, to have a strategic, business conversation. Otherwise, it's going nowhere.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting question. I agree. I think when you think about budgeting, the suggestion I'd make is, and again, I think somebody else referenced it before, in the scenario planning, is Puneet, in the scenario planning is here's our base case, right? Our base case has a set of assumptions associated with it. We're growing at X percent. Our churn rate here's our churn rate, here's our NRR, here's our GRR, et cetera, bookings, and so on and so forth. And then what is usually most effective, I found, is just kind of being in the room on these kinds of things, is then you have a very targeted conversation about, here's the increment that we that we want to examine. So here's a growth, here's base case plus, and we're going to open a new market, we're going to expand into a new market, into new geography, into what have you, new vertical, and here's what's required to get us there. What needs to be true? I think I heard this before. We were talking about this. What needs to be true, right?
Yep.
For this to happen, and that's the reality. Like, if you've been in the room in these senior leadership meetings, or if you've been in the board meetings with the investors, these are the conversations that take place. And there's also part of it was implicit, May, in your in the spicy question you posed, is is the company set up to scale, right? So are we carrying a lot of technical debt? Are we carrying a lot of things that require our implementation teams to do manual things, or we require engineering to help spin up customers? What are the boat anchors that we're carrying, and do we have an attack plan for reducing or eliminating that risk factor that would impede our ability to scale our growth in one fashion without scaling the expense profile in the same curve?
A couple things just in my experience with this. One, to Marlon's point, your company, say this is a out of the blue thing that comes in, something changes and you need to go there. Your company needs to have an out of cycle process for dealing with something like this, right? We can't just wait till the next annual planning cycle to do it. We need to have the ability to be flexible on the fly. And that may mean a reallocation of budget we have. It may be, one CPO I've worked with, they would look for tranches of investment to get to certain points in testing and validating. And that takes you to Puneet's stage gate type approach to it's going to be an incremental funding, but we have to have the plan there. Okay. We're going to test this idea to validate this. If more than 60% of people find this, whatever, we open up the next tranche of investment, and that means we're going to be adding support or whatever else. And so you're really I let you take the spicy question, but it really led to one of the questions I was going to ask was like, how would we change this process if we could, right? Should we move to more project-based funding to help with this type of stuff? To give us the ability to fund this type of stuff. I don't know. Puneet, before we move in, I want to get a couple of wrap-up stuff before we go. But Puneet, I want to give you a chance on this spicy question as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good one, right? Like most of my experiences in this have been disruptive events, and I think there's a parallel there to like when you need to pivot your strategy ultimately, right? In disruptive events, you're kind of forced to make that call, as opposed to in this case where it's like an opportunistic thing where you still have a decision to make as to whether this is worth investing or not, right? I think in general, Derek really had a solid approach to this, right? Like you have to look at what was the framework? Like what would need to be true, right?
Yeah.
I think that's usually how I break it down as well. Like in terms of like what are the assumptions we're making? What are the riskiest assumptions that exist there? And like what's our confidence in them? What evidence do we have internally that justifies this? Right? Is it pure belief? Is it some qualitative stuff? Is it some data that we've seen? Right? And what's the risk appetite of the organization? Like what is, in the simplest terms, what is the minimal investment we can make to prove this out? Right?
Yep.
And usually you should be able to carve that out without disrupting your budget. Right? If we don't have that much slack in our bandwidth and our capacity, we're doing a whole other bunch of problems, right? Like we got to go back to the basics there. So
we may not have it in our product budget, but every CEO I've ever worked with has some sort of secret funding, right? Where they can, go to the well and, things that they hide in other categories that if they need it for something, could do this. Sweetlin, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think besides what everyone has mentioned, like having these, what I found helpful is having regular checkpoints with the finance team as well. Because then you have this regular cadence of checking in on what Puneet mentioned about assumptions.
Yep.
I think the crux of all of this, whether it's a disruptive event or whether it's opportunistic, what's really key is storytelling. So even the budgets we think about as like dollars and cents and a very quantitative exercise, I actually think budgeting is a storytelling exercise. We are able to tell this, even before you get into the actual numbers, what is the story you're telling about like the strategy or where we're heading or how the markets have changed? Because once you get people bought into the story, I trust teams to be very creative. So I'll give you examples. When COVID unfolded, right, all of us had to really pivot and change the strategy, whether that you had to move online and your business skyrocketed, or like your brick and mortar, and you have to really rethink operations. Like when people understand like why something is happening, what has changed, I think there's a lot of flexibility and agility that people embrace the moment and dive in. So I think storytelling is very critical. Both blending the data of like what are the assumptions and risks, etc., and what this means for the P&L, but also bringing people along. And when people are excited and bought in, you can actually move mountains. Is what I've seen.
I love that. I could completely and totally. And I think sometimes we need to we need to break ourselves from the constraints that we put in naturally. And sometimes these big events are there. Yeah, I'm not going to do it. Scott Selhorst is proposing that we make this conversation 2 hours because it's going so well. But he proposes that every week. So even when he's on the call. So I'll do it. I want to do a quick, we're going to get to a wrap up, which is the key learnings and takeaways. I just want to do a quick, really lightning round. If you're talking to a product leader who's now for the first time ever sitting down in the budgeting process, one big piece of advice, 30 seconds. Derek.
Prep, right? Do not
do your prep work.
Do the prep work. Sit with your engineering leaders, sit with your marketing leaders, sit with the FP&A team, and if you have access to the CFO, right? It's a team sport, and it's not a product budget; it's a company budget.
I love that. Sui Lin.
I would say be an investor. And what that means is thinking about the budget as like a portfolio of bets. And depending on your company context, like what are the bets you're putting in, thinking through the risk and rewards profiles of the investments.
I love that. Marlon.
I think my first thing would be to tell them is to find out what the mission is, because depending upon whether you're at a large multinational or you're at a scale up that's private equity owned, you may be somewhere along the pathway that will be prohibitive towards what you think you ought to be doing if you don't know what the mission is. Maybe they're from a private equity perspective, maybe they're near the end and getting towards exit. Your budget's going to look different than it is when you first walk into that door. So I would say know the mission, be very clear about it.
Love it. Puneet.
I think assume that things will go wrong, right? So when you're budgeting, assume you're going to need more than you think today, and when you're planning and allocating, assume you're not going to get everything you asked for.
Boy, that might be the most real answer yet. May.
If you are allowed to talk about it, tell your team about the process. You know, we all come from that place where we work for someone who had to set a budget. So the more training we give to our reports and the people who are going to become project leaders, the better budgeting we'll get later on.
And the better they'll be prepared when they're the one at the table. I love that. As Scott said, I wish this conversation could keep going on. I feel that every time, and I appreciate everybody and the insight. I've learned so much on this one already. Our wrap-up questions, key learnings and takeaways. What are you taking away from this call, right? This is a place for us to learn and grow and learn new perspectives. What's your key learning and takeaway from this, Derek?
I really liked two things. The W construct and scenario planning. I think those are really valuable insights. And so I was really, psyched to hear about that, hear those things stressed. So, that's a great takeaway.
I love it. Sui Lin.
My takeaway is that we should talk more often. I think it's great. I think it's so good hearing like everyone's perspectives of how you think about budgeting and how you think about like strategy, because like we learn from each other. And I think of it as more like even budgeting is like a product. You iterate on it. You have a perspective, you have some assumptions going in, and you iterate on it. And like I think these conversations really help shape like how we approach it, but also like the assumptions that we put into the budgets.
I love that. We do these every other week, and as you can see in the comments, we've got many people who have been panelists who are coming on and still participating. So we'll get you back on more. You've been great, but also participate in the comments, and maybe we do something bigger at some point. But I love that. Marlon, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think this started with either Derek or Praneet, where you were saying get the team out of the office to. It was around learnings. I don't know which one said that, but I think that's also is great, and that's one of my takeaways. And I think it morphed into a cultural thing, and how to motivate the team with Sweet Lynn, which I tend to be very egg-headed at how I come at this, which is frameworks and scenario plannings, and that's kind of an afterthought for me, but it's something that I really need to like push up into how I deploy that and use that. So those are my two takeaways.
Awesome. Thank you, Marlon. Puneet.
Mine's similar in nature. I think Sweeland's point about picking these themes of focusing learning initiatives, and then Derek, your explanation of how you actually incentivize people to break out of their day to day to create that space, and then how you tied that back into the budget allocation. I think that gave me definitely food for thought there. So I'm excited to try some stuff out there.
Thank you, Puneet. My friend May.
I've been thinking a lot about what Sweelan said about basically you're not budgeting for the product you built last year. You're budgeting for the product you're about to build. So start from that place of strategy and go from there.
I will build on that. Marlon talked about the three horizons and sort of the zone to win. I think that comes there. But I have to go, I said Puneet and Sweetlin were in the clubhouse. I think Sweetlin, I'm going back at the beginning about the holistic approach to considering what we have to do to invest in our people. I think for me, that was right at the beginning. And I thank Scott Selhorst for capturing it so well, because as I was thinking about it, his comment came in great. So Derek, Sweetlin, thank you guys so much for being on this for your first time. Hopefully you guys, Sweetlin, so I should say, hopefully, Derek, you're just as excited as Sweetlin is to be in some more of these conversations. We'd love to have you back. Marlon, Puneet, every time you guys have been on, you guys have been so insightful. I learned so much from both of you, so thank you guys so much. And May, I couldn't do this without you, so thank you, everybody. We're already past time. We're not going to go to 2 hours, Scott, sorry. But thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with another topic, and I have to punt on what we had originally planned because I haven't done my pre-work for it. So May and I are going to work on finding the next topic, and we look forward to seeing you guys back in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.